most of the Arab world now is children and adolescents and young adults below the age of 30. And what they're showing, the results of surveys and polling and focus groups with them, I think is quite striking, because what it's showing is a multiplicity of identities. And we talked before about these different identities. I think one of the weaknesses of the Western media, particularly the American media, one of the weaknesses in covering the Arab world, and now of course they don't talk of the Arab world, it's now Islam. I mean, you talk about the Islamic world, and you don't talk about Jordanians and Palestinians, you talk of Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds, and so that's another question. But one of the weaknesses is the inability of the mainstream media to understand the nuances of identity, that individual citizens can feel Muslim, can feel Jordanian, can feel pan-Arab, can feel that they're democracy activists, that they have rights as women or as youth, that they're lawyers, that they have multiple identities, and they're friends with the United States, they love Western values, but they're critical of American policy or Israeli policy. They'd like to make peace with Israel, but they want a fair peace. That there's these many levels of sentiment which translate into many multiple identities that are all naturally part of the same person. And people bring to the surface that element of their complex identity, which is the most important one at that moment. So you and I are talking as, say, journalists and academics and analysts, but then, you know, I'll go home and I might be a football coach, and you go home and you might be a basketball coach, and that's another element of our identity. Of course, at the University of Maryland, you have good basketball, so so you know we have these other elements of identity. Or we go home and we're husbands and fathers, and so these multiple identities are not captured very well. And what young people are showing, I think this is really the fascinating thing now in terms of this youth element, because of the media to a large extent, the new media, the opportunities that they have, which we didn't. You know, we didn't have all these media when we were 15 years old, but now kids have, and not just kids, but high schools, university, young adults, can express themselves in so many ways that we didn't have, can express themselves and can get information. And what they're doing is they're overcoming the constraints of their society, whether it's the political constraints and the security constraints of their governments, the social constraints of their family, the cultural, religious, other constraints of their wider societies and communities. They're overcoming those constraints by finding mechanisms through the media and in other ways and civil society to actually express their other identities. And therefore they end up with what we're finding with some of the youth research we and others around the region are doing, is that young people are living in many cases double and triple lives, not necessarily in a bad way, that they're at home they behave in a certain way, after school in the community they behave in a way, and then they go off to the mall, and then they're on the internet at night, and in each one of these areas they have a slightly different identity. And I think it's really important for people outside the Arab world to capture that nuance, because it helps people then understand what are the concerns that people express in these different identities, and then it helps governments, civil society and others to deal with these societies on the basis of what people really think.
You know, it's interesting because you were talking, I was thinking about the identity issue, which, you know, I study in the Arab world. But when I went to the Palestinian citizens of Israel and I asked them to rank their identities, I start by saying, I know you are all these things, as you said, because everybody is, you know, if you're talking about political identity, everyone is at once, you know, an Arab or a Muslim or Christian or Jordanian or Palestinian or whatever. All of that comes together. It's just sometimes I just ask them, which one at this point do you feel is more important to you? And so I ask them to rank it. And obviously you get a variety of rankings across the board. And I think it's more like a division within the self. I don't even see it. I think actually what I document as a public opinion divide, very often it is a divide within the self, because people are competing with themselves, within themselves. So I do think there's something to that, you know, psychologically that goes on that you can document. But something very interesting that is parallel within Jewish Israelis, because once I started looking at Palestinian citizens of Israel, there were questions that I was then interested in figuring out whether they were true about Jewish citizens, and then to compare them with the rest of the Arab world, including identity questions. In the Arab world, we found, for example, that 2/3 of Arabs identify themselves first as a Muslim or Arab, and only 1/3 identify with the state first, aggregately. It varies from country to country. But Lebanon, for example, is Lebanon first, despite all the sectarianism. It's like a defense mechanism that you find happening. But everywhere else,
It's a great wish. It's a great desire.
it's a great desire. It's just like, but the others are not Lebanese. They're not real Lebanese. But that you find that over there. But in Israel itself, actually, it turns out Jewish citizens identify themselves as Jewish first and Israeli second.
Wow.
And that's interesting in this. And also when you ask them to react to certain media information about the other, how they react, it's more they see it as a threat to their identity rather than as a need to embrace when they look at victims on the other side. Exactly what happens in the Arab world.